So I figured the best way we can do this is talk about how the meta is shaped up since Lurrus's ban and back in May, and then talk about how the meta looks currently using probably the last major challenge as an example. Then go into the decks themselves and talk through what I think they do in terms of the metagame. Where do I think they shine? Which lists do I recommend? I think that's the best way to approach this. So let's start from the very beginning then. Let's start at the meta game itself. Hopefully this is going to be big enough that you guys can see. Hopefully I'll probably put a link down in the YouTube post production, but let's try to zoom in here. Hopefully this is a bit more readable. How's that look? Looks okay. So this is the merge spreadsheet. So if you follow me on Twitter, you know that every week, the Vintage Streaming Discord, if they were in the tournaments and played to the very end, will watch the replays and calculate the data and record the data for all of the players who played in an event. This way, we get to see what decks are being played in the challenges, how well these decks are doing in terms of win rate, and we get a little bit of an insight on what's Vintage like right now. A lot of formats don't have a lot of public data. Wizards pulled back a lot on that public data when formats were starting to be solved too fast, and they only released those 5.0 lists every week. If you were to only go by the 5.0 list, you really wouldn't have much to work with. But as of right now, because the challenges are so small, sometimes 40 on Sunday and 70 on Saturday is probably the average. Maybe 50 on Sunday and 70 on Saturday is a better term. You can actually go through and watch all those replays and get a good sense of what is happening at any point in time. So every week we put those spreadsheets together, and very recently Matt did a merging. So all of the data that we've collected, it's not every week, it's not every event, it's most of them. I would probably say 85% plus of the challenges and other premier level events like the NYC, PAX, Gen Con. We put together lists for most of those events. So it actually ends up being a pretty substantial number of matches, 14,000 matches. You're really not going to find 14,000 matches worth of vintage data anywhere else. So this is the data starting from May 18th, which is, I believe, the date that Lurrus was banned. This was a ban announcement. I believe it just included Lurrus. More of an emergency fix to the companions in general. Not the big fix where they changed them and made them cost 3 more mana, but this is the first one where I think it was Lurrus in Vintage, and then it was Lurrus and Zerda in Legacy, if I recall correctly. Don't quote me on that one. I don't pay too much attention to Legacy, but you could really see the visible difference in the format from before Lurrus was banned to after Lurrus was banned. Lurrus was, by all means, one of the most format warping cards of all time. Obviously extremely powerful, and the way people dealt with Lurrus was very different to what people would think of in classical Vintage. Lurrus was a time where people were playing deadweight in their main decks. Like, this was a crazy time. Everybody had Caracas. Very crazy. So there's really no point in thinking of looking at the data before the Lurrus ban, but after the Lurrus ban, the data has seemed pretty consistent. Obviously, there's metagame evolutions week to week. Some decks are on top from one week, some decks are on top the next week. Decks get better, decks get worse based on just the builds and what people are expecting. So actually, the data becomes pretty similar starting after that. So that's why we're looking at this start date and the end date being last week's challenge. And so the big things you're going to look for here, you want to look at metagame percentage, and you want to look at win rate. And obviously, 14,000 is still not enough data to draw like super confident conclusions, but it draws pretty reasonable ones. And the confidence intervals, from what I understand about them, I am no data analyst or statistician. Is that how you actually say that? Statistician? I think that's how you say that. From what I can see, this is like a really good chunk of data to look at. So if you're looking at the very high level, so the way we break it down in these metagame analyses is we list things by archetype, like a high level archetype. Those archetypes are based on the high level build around me's. So shops are Mishra's Workshop decks. Bazaar decks are Bazaar Baghdad decks, and these encompass all varieties of Bazaar Baghdad decks. So they accomplish HogaakVine, HollowVine, and Dredge. Xerox is most of the strategies that are playing for preordain. Combo encompasses most of the combo decks. So this would include Doomsday, PO, DPS, decks like that. DRS stands for Deathrite Shaman. So these are your bug and your 4-color Deathrite Shaman decks. These decks play out a little bit different than the Xerox decks. These decks are typically more of a mid-range style. And from the way we looked at it, Deathrite makes them a separate category from Xerox, even though some people may argue that these Deathrite decks are still Xerox decks. Xerox, I'm not going to go into a huge deal, but it's really the restricted blue shell, centering around 4 Preordains, Mystic Sanctuary, Ancestor Recall, gosh, these kind of cards. Oath is an archetype that's like a very classic vintage archetype, but it's an archetype that's been dwindling in popularity in the last few years. Very much on the low end of things. Other blue really is all the non-4 Preordained Xerox decks. Sometimes these are decks that are like Tinker-based decks or decks that don't really fall under like PO or Xerox.
Oh
but
no, here comes the Hogaak, love is 3 gawk, love is 3 gawk, love is 3 gawk.
Thanks, Mike. And then Eldrazi is obviously Eldrazi, whereas other encompasses all the rogue archetypes that don't fall in these categories. So that's at the high level. That's at the archetype level. When you break it down into the sub-archetype level, you start to see some more distinct categories. But let's just start by looking at the archetype level. When you go back all the way to May, so that's now, 5 months? So it's a pretty long time. The highest percentage of decks have been, since Lurrus' banning, combo decks. So highest percentage of decks are mostly like PO and Doomsday. Those are the decks that take a very large percentage of the combo archetype. But you also have really substantial metagame percentages of Deathrite, of Xerox, of Bazaar, and of Shops. And these are your 5 major things, where most of these other decks you would consider, fringe players or outliers. It hasn't been all as combo-centric lately in the last few weeks, but when you look at the data as a whole since Lurrus' banning, combo decks came out to a very fast start with the restriction of Lurrus, or the banning of Lurrus. And none of these archetypes at the highest level are putting up like incredible win rates. Obviously, Deathrite Shaman decks and combo decks looking pretty good at 52, almost 53% here, with Bazaar decks also at 52. You can see Shops is kind of underperforming, whereas Xerox decks, you do hurt when you look at the highest level of Xerox decks, because there is obviously a lot of nuance once you get into the sub-archetype level, where you're playing a Rug deck, you're playing a Jeskai deck, you're playing a Breach combo deck, which is a Xerox deck with a combo finish. And so that does kind of get a little bit diluted when you look at the highest level. And maybe at this highest level, it's not enough to tell you, conclusive evidence of anything, but it does give you kind of a look at how all the Mishra's Work decks are faring, how all the Bazaar Bag decks are faring, and because these decks really operate extremely differently from each other, it does provide some insight, right? And so I think when you look at this, it does kind of mirror how I feel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the data, and I'm going to tell you how I feel. How I feel is subjective, right? It's what I think. It's it's not facts, but it's when I play this much vintage and I see the data every week, I think I can draw some like conclusions that maybe you can trust. That's up to you, obviously. But I do feel like Deathrite decks recently have been putting up incredible numbers, and that the reason is because I think that the Bazaar decks are extremely powerful. And Deathrite decks consistently are the fun police when it comes to archetypes like Shops and Bazaar. Deathrite decks are the ones that have the most options to deal with these decks, and the reasons are pretty simple, right? A Deathrite deck is a deck that typically is going to run Wastelands. When you're Wastelanding Bazaar, Bazaar is having a hard time. When you are eating cards out of their graveyard with with your Deathrite Shaman, Bazaar is having a hard time. Deathrite Shaman can accelerate you over the sphere effects, and the Deathrite Shaman decks are obviously green, so they're playing Force of Vigor, so they're really easily able to deal with Shops' game plan. Now, where does Deathrite Shaman suffer? Deathrite Shaman suffers a little bit when you play against like a Jeskai Xerox deck, a deck that does the fair plan a little bit better. They can also suffer sometimes versus combo, but it really depends on the matchup and how much you respect it, right? If my Deathrite Shaman deck runs 4 Collector Oof, it's going to be a lot better off against PO than a Deathrite Shaman deck that runs 0. And that's just kind of how I feel. When you look at recent metagame and recent data on something like Goldfish, which puts together the top 32s of every challenge, as well as some of the 5-0s and the prelim events, you'll see that Sultai is playing a large part of the metagame at this level. And a lot of people are playing this deck as it does fare reasonably well against things like PO and Golos and Dredge and Hogaak, that kind of thing. Where does this go? All right, so let's shift over a little bit and let's look a little closer. Let's look at sub-archetypes. When you start to break down the sub-archetypes, you're trying to separate your higher level categories. So at Shops, instead of just Shops decks, we're going to look into a little closer. Ravager encompassing the aggro shops, things that have Arcbound Ravagers, Walking Ballistas, Foundry Inspectors. They're trying to attack you rather than, play a Golos. And then Prison, which encompasses most of these Golos decks, things that are looking to Crucible Wasteland you, or lock you under a bunch of spheres while, denying your mana. And obviously some decks fall somewhere in between those, so it's really, a week-to-week distinction by the people who are doing data recording. Like maybe there's a deck that plays Ravagers and Golos, and maybe it could be considered a Ravager or a Prison deck. So like I said, these are not, concrete analysis by any means. It's not 100% to fall in the place that makes the most sense or is the most useful, but it does give you a general idea, right? And so we break down Shops into Ravager and Prison. We break down Bazaar into what I said before, Dredge, HogaakVine, and HollowVine. For those of you guys who don't know, all 3 of these Bazaar decks play very differently. You'll see them broken up in those categories here as well. HogaakVine is a creature-based Bazaar deck that actually has mana sources, can cast spells, Deathrite Shaman, Vengevine. That's not a good list. Hold on, let me find a more normal list. You're using your graveyard and you're using Bazaar of Baghdad, but what you're doing is trying to put creatures like Bloodghast back into play so that you can play Hogaaks, right? Whereas a deck like Dredge is going all in on the graveyard. You're not playing other lands. You're only playing 4 Bazaars. You're trying to mulligan to your Bazaar of Baghdad and quickly use your Dredge cards to fill up your graveyard and execute a kill. This deck plays very differently to a deck that does get to play mana sources and does get to cast spells like Hogaak. And then even separately from them are the decks that we label as HollowVine. Obviously not the best descriptor. But this deck is more of a tempo deck. It's using Bazaar of Baghdad, but it's using cards like Squee to offset the card disadvantage from Bazaar of Baghdad, as well as tons and tons of free counters. So Force of Negation, Force of Vigor, Mindbreak Trap, Force of Will. You actually are playing a strategy that's more akin to a Delver strategy in Legacy, where you're trying to play a Hollow One or some Vengevines and then protect it with your counter spells. And so all 3 of those decks play differently, and so you kind of want to analyze their metagame percentages as well as their win rates a little bit differently. And as you can see, these aren't the highest number of pilots, so it's a little hard to draw super meaningful conclusions, but you can see that HogaakVine is putting up, higher numbers than HollowVine or Dredge right now. We try to break down the blue decks into control, combo, and aggro. I think this is a little bit better than trying to break them down into like Rug, Jeskai, a more controlling Rug deck, a more aggro Rug deck, a combo-oriented Rug deck. When you start to really break down the blue decks, you lose a little bit sight and you end up with numbers that are really small. And so you typically find things like Jeskai, Jeskai Arcanist, those kind of decks, and Rug, where you're playing Ren and 6 and Goyf. And like both of those decks are obviously playing Dak Faden. Those will end up in the control category, whereas decks that are centered around like Underworld Breach combos, those decks will end up more in the combo category. Bug and 4-color control are your 2 DRS, your 2 Deathrite Shaman archetypes. The the big difference is 4-color control is playing Pyroblast. It's almost always the huge difference. The 4-color control has access to Pyroblast and Dak Faden, whereas the bug deck, typically overloading on Assassin's Trophy and Okos and those kind of things. Inside of combo, the two main archetypes we have are PO and Ritual. Ritual's a little annoying for me because for a while, the only playable Ritual deck was Doomsday, and DPS was an extremely low metagame percentage. And then Reed Duke played DPS, and the numbers shot up. So right now, DPS and Ritual decks are both in the high level sheet because starting in May, those decks are under the same category as Ritual. In some of the lower level sheets, we actually started separating Doomsday and DPS because DPS did, present itself as the much more viable Ritual deck. And so when we look at these field, we do see the really large numbers in combo. Combo has been very heavily represented recently, especially not as much recently, but more in the beginning after Lurrus was banned. You'll see Doomsday and PO representing large portions of the metagame field. And the reason for that, speculatively, is they're really powerful, right? Killing people with Doomsday and killing people with PO maybe that feels more of like a vintage thing, right? You're doing an extremely powerful thing that you're not really doing in other formats, and maybe that draws a large number of players in. Obviously, both of these decks are strong in their own right. A weekend doesn't go by where Doomsday or PO doesn't make a top 8 of a challenge. So, especially with Doomsday being, this is like slightly higher when you separate out the DPS decks. I did a manual query where I was able to separate out the Doomsday, and it's a little bit closer to 54, but not like super close. It's still pretty close to the overall rate because there's actually not that many DPS pieces of data to really change the Doomsday metrics. But obviously both these decks are strong and viable choices. Even though they're being played in huge numbers, they're not putting out crazy win percentages, but they are putting out very respectable win percentages, especially for decks that are probably picked up by newer players a lot. When you looked at the DRS numbers over here, you saw a pretty high number, almost 53. And that's represented inside of the bug and 4-color control, both of these decks putting up numbers around 53. Obviously doing very well in the current metagame. Very strong against their Bazaar opponents and their Shops opponents. We don't have head-to-head matchups here. We don't really have the level of data clarity to provide that. But when I tell you things go head-to-head, it's just my perspective, which could be right or wrong. I'm not by any means a Deathrite Shaman expert or a Xerox expert. I can only tell you what my feelings are from having played, some amount of them and having seen a lot of them being played against each other. I guess I should really try to show you these numbers, which are not substantially different. They might be a little more accurate. And this is the estimation without mirrors. I'm not exactly sure how Matt does this. I know that I'm not 100% sure on the math on this one, but Matt is really smart and did a lot of really cool things to actually get a little bit more data clarity here, which is really cool. Inside of Xerox, I would probably ignore this data point as it's just really, really small. The decks we typically classify as Xerox aggro are decks that are more centered around your pace of play and your tempo. Typically, these decks are like blue-red Sprite Dragon decks. They might play, what is the not Stormblood Berserker? What is the one that's one red Scab Clan Berserker? As a way to like really beat combo. Whereas most of your Jeskai and Rug decks fall into this Xerox control category. And this gets a little diluted, right? There's a lot of different archetypes that might have different, win percentages versus the field. So you do have to kind of take this with a grain of salt and say, well, maybe my Rug deck is a little bit stronger versus the field than the Jeskai decks, and so this number might not be super accurate. But they're not performing poorly. They're performing, like a 50-50 fair deck maybe should. Whereas the Xerox combo decks, this is mostly Breach. There are some other decks that kind of float around in this category, but for the most part, Xerox combo means a deck that's not trying to win the game as fast as possible, or it's a little bit hard to quantify, but it's or to explain how we do this, but mostly decks that are capable of playing a control game but happen to have a combo finish. Yeah, this one will sound like a lot of gibberish.
Another stream where
sure.
I DK what you are talking about, but I love you.
I appreciate that. Edgar asks, is PO favored versus Xerox? And the answer to that is typically no. Typically, PO decks struggle against control decks based around Pyroblast. So I would consider Jeskai unfavorable. Rug is a little bit better than Jeskai sometimes, but depending on the number of collector oofs they play, it can get a lot worse. This is the confidence interval I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. This is the confidence is it integral or interval? Confidence interval. You can Google it. It's I believe it's supposed to show how accurate how accurate we're assuming the data is based on something. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure, so I didn't put together that part of the sheet. This is Matt Murray's creation, and I've been pretty far out of things like data analytics and stats and that kind of stuff. So I don't want to say something wrong on this, where then you go and yell at me that I'm wrong. But if you look it up on the internet, which is a great place, highly recommend, they can give you a better explanation. I'm just going to keep going through these really quickly. HollowVine, this number is like pretty interesting to me because I do feel like HollowVine is a very powerful deck. The thing HollowVine has struggled with recently is that people have adapted. So I pointed this out on Twitter for somebody. I don't know if it was Edgar or someone else. They asked why people were playing Surgical Extraction. Typically not the most powerful graveyard hate. And the big reason that people stopped playing things like it was cool to cop. The big reason people stopped playing things like Grafdigger's Cage, Rest in Peace, these permanent based, Leyline of the Void, these permanent based graveyard hate, which are typically like I would consider a little bit stronger than Surgical Extraction, is because HollowVine, HogaakVine, and Dredge were all given Force of Vigor with Modern Horizons. Force of Vigor is an extremely powerful card. I don't really think it's seeing the waves in other formats like it's seeing in Vintage. Force of Vigor really enables these the graveyard combo decks that are using Bazaar of Baghdad, or decks that are using Mishra's Workshop to put out artifacts. It's weird because it really hurt the Shops decks, because decks could play this free removal that hits all their things, but it actually really helped these graveyard decks because they could play free removal that hits all the hate pieces. And so the metagame actually adapted. There was a while where HollowVine was putting up absurd numbers. There was something like 60% win rates in challenges. HollowVine was really standing out as like a very top tier deck. And what happened was everybody adapted, which is good. The metagame obviously is moving in a healthy way in that sense. Basically, people stopped playing these permanent-based disruption and started playing spell-based disruption, or permanent-based disruption that was not hit by Force of Vigor. So what they did was people started playing 4 Surgical Extractions and 2 Tabernacles in most decks. And so what this did was, against decks like HollowVine, which don't play as many lands, Tabernacle wipes their board, and Surgical Extraction stops unfair things like returning Vengevines or recurring Squee every turn. And this really actually put a really big damper on HollowVine's win percentage, and HollowVine actually just dropped straight off. There was an increase in Wastelands, an increase in Tabernacles, and an increase in Surgicals, and HollowVine kind of dropped off. And obviously, it's actually been a long time since that happened, and since then, HollowVine has adapted. HollowVine actually plays a bit better now against cards like Tabernacle than it used to. Pilots play a little bit better around Tabernacle, and it actually is pretty interesting. But still, HollowVine didn't really end up recovering from its like up to the high point it had earlier in the year. And the way the metagame is currently set with high percentages of Deathrite Shaman decks, there's lots of Wastelands right now. the format actually has tons and tons of mana denial. You're looking at Wasteland decks. You're looking at decks with 4 Assassin's Trophies. These bug decks are playing 4 Assassin's Trophies. You're looking at Golos decks out of shops that are playing Crucibles in the main or Ghost Quarter. So you're looking at really heavy mana denial. And when HollowVine and Dredge don't have their Bazaar, they struggle. HogaakVine can play through that kind of hate a little better, but HollowVine really struggles. And one of the answers, Mike is absolutely correct. One of the big adaptations that HollowVine made was to start playing Gaia's Cradles in their main deck as an answer to Tabernacle, which was really, really impressive, actually. The HollowVine pilots like Montolio did do a lot of work in revitalizing this archetype, even if it's right now not at its highest point. The real king of the Bazaar decks right now, at least in my opinion, and at least in the way these stats look, still going way into the red. Sorry, I'm still working out this new microphone. I'm gonna just turn it down a little bit more. So I'm just pushing way past the red again. Bear with me for a second. Did it sound really bad when I was speaking louder, like it was getting cut off at the top end? Any input you guys have is great, because I'm trying to just work through this new mic. I think I can just lower the gain a little bit, and then this way, hopefully, we don't push too far past the boundaries. Didn't notice any clipping. All right, well, that's a good sign. It's a good sign. Awesome. Thank you. So, actually, one of the decks that really suffered from the change in metagame, where people were playing Tabernacles, Surgical not as much, but more Tabernacle and Wastelands, is that Dredge actually suffered as as a byproduct of people attacking HollowVine. Dredge has a really hard time with Tabernacle. They have to, bring in their own Wastelands, and they need to bring these things in from the sideboard to actually deal with the Tabernacles. So Dredge actually has become a little bit, I guess, underplayed recently. We can look at the last challenge and see if this is the case, but from what I know and from what I've talked to with Dredge pilots, is they don't feel like it's as powerful as playing one of the Vengevine decks. They feel like it's not as well suited against the current metagame. Obviously, the restriction of Golgari Grave Troll did a lot to hurt that, and the restriction of Mental Misstep did a lot to hurt that. So it's been kind of on a decline since then. But even recently, it hasn't been putting up crazy numbers, but it is still playable. And then you're looking at these Shops decks, which are having these really bad win rates over time. I do think that they're in a bad spot. I do think that Force of Vigor has really made it hard for the Shops decks to get an upper hand. I do think that I'm not really a big fan of the Golos Shops deck. I don't think it does as powerful things. Edgar asked if I have strong thoughts on Containment Priest. I think Containment Priest is at a very low... Oh, I skipped Hogaak. Okay, I'll go back to Hogaak, sorry. I am hopping around because I don't really have a planned order here. I'm just going to keep spewing until I don't want to talk anymore. So I'll go back to Hogaak. I am going to answer questions as we go. Edgar asked if I have strong thoughts on Containment Priest. I think Containment Priest is at a low point. I don't think Containment Priest does enough against decks like Hogaak. It doesn't actually stop a Hogaak from coming into play. It doesn't stop a Hollow one from coming into play. It does stop, Bloodghast, and it stops Vengevine, but sometimes that can be too late. I think Containment Priest was at a really big point against, it's obviously great against Dredge, but Dredge is tempered down. Oath is tempered down. I really don't think that Containment Priest is a super strong answer right now. A nice part about Containment Priest is it is an onboard threat that doesn't get Force of Vigored, so there's a plus side there. Decks like HollowVine and Dredge don't really play as much permanent removal. HollowVine plays almost none. Dredge sometimes plays things like Sickening Shoal. Obviously, HogaakVine has Assassin's Trophy. So I'm not huge on Containment Priest right now. But yeah, Dredge got hit by association with HollowVine doing very well at some point in the last year. And then for Shops, I do think the Golos deck's kind of a trap. I know people have had some success with it, and obviously I think that's the power of Mishra's Workshop. But if I had to guess, a better Shops deck for this weekend is probably Ravager, though I don't really have that much to go by on that. I think both these decks have suffered from a couple of major things. One thing is that Force of Vigor really pushed them down. A second thing is that the Jeskai decks and these Xerox decks are not bad against shops anymore. Historically, your blue decks are bad against shops, but that's just not true anymore. And the big change there was Shattering Spree plus Dreadhorde Arcanist. It actually allows you to really just destroy all of shops' permanents. It's really, really impressive against shops. So with shops losing its best matchups like combo, oh, I guess I didn't even talk about that. PO also had a really big really big importance in shops' decline. PO is like a combo deck that actually is just favored versus shops. When you think of past combo decks like Dark Petition Storm and these Storm decks, they're always really, really bad against Sphere of Resistance and the shops decks. But with the shops' continual restriction of things like Glowstone Golem, shops is actually unfavored versus PO, not heavily favored versus Xerox anymore. And it has to deal with Force of Vigor out of the fair green decks, and even the unfair decks have Force of Vigors. So while I still think shops is not that bad against some of these unfair Bazaar decks, it's still an issue. I think I agree, not me. If you play a Jeskai deck or a Xerox deck that takes shops as a serious opponent, you can build the deck to be favored, or at least slightly favored. I don't know how favored is. That's obviously on a spectrum. Anyways, I'm gonna go back real quickly to HogaakVine. I do think this is the best Bazaar variant. The reason being is it plays through hate the best. This deck plays very well through hate. It gets to cast spells. It gets to cast removal. It can hard cast almost all of its creatures. So people really have to look at this as an aggro deck that has an unfair upside, which is really, really impressive. And then not to mention that Hogaak has a really great transforming sideboard where it brings in lots of permanent-based combo hate. Decks that the Hogaak decks that play Deafening Silence, I think Deafening Silence and Collector Roof combined do a very good job of beating down on decks like PO and Doomsday, which are typically very unfavored matchups for a non-Force of Will Bazaar deck, right? But I actually think the currently configured sideboards of Hogaak do a decent job of letting you play against these combo decks, specifically PO. Doomsday to not as much of an extent. I think the Doomsday matchup is still really, really bad. But the good part about the Doomsday matchup is when you play something like 4 Deafening Silence, Doomsday is actually really bad against permanent-based disruption. Doomsday can play through counter-based disruption really easily. It's playing all these dazes and all these flusters. It's always going to win a counter battle, right? But they only play like 1 chain sometimes maybe 2 chains, chains of vapor. So if you play a turn 1 Deafening Silence as the Hogaak player, you've just bought yourself a ton of time. You actually have a pretty reasonable chance of establishing your clock and actually being able to kill the Doomsday player. Not to mention that hitting the Doomsday player early does make things more challenging for the Doomsday player. If the Doomsday player can't cast multiple spells in 1 turn, and they're having their life total against a deck that plays hasty 4/3s, it can get a little dicey. So I'm actually really impressed with this deck. I'm also a little biased because I think it's my favorite deck, my favorite non-PO deck. But that's just the data from I just wanted to explain what this data looked like and what it was doing and what it might mean. And then I want to go into recent data to see what we might expect for the weekend, and then I'll kind of go through what I think are good choices and what deck lists I might recommend based on those. So, log, we started, I don't know, maybe a half an hour ago. It should say on stream. You missed my explanation of what this data means, what the decks are in the format, but you kind of already know all of that stuff. But don't anyone worry who tuned in late. All of my videos go on YouTube, so I will be posting this video probably in its entirety, not cut up or anything, on my YouTube channel after the stream. So if you missed any of the first 45 minutes and you want to catch up on what I talked about, feel free to check out my YouTube channel. The link is in chat and down below. So it is no big deal if you ended up missing any of our initial section. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring up the last challenges data, and I'm going to take Saturday's data just because it's a little bit of a bigger field. Sunday ends up being not that the Sunday data isn't good, but the Sunday data ends up being smaller, 40 to 50 players, and it ends up being a different subsection of the vintage community. So when you start playing vintage, you end up seeing a lot of the same names a lot. And I've been trying to reach out to as many people as I can, and we end up, getting to know a lot of the vintage players. And there's some big play groups, right? There's an East Coast play group, a West Coast play group. There's a large number of European players, and there's a very large number of Japanese players. And you typically end up for the Saturday, in my mind, the Sunday challenge, which is 3 a.m. my time. You end up with a lot of the Japanese players and a lot of the European players. For the European players, it starts early in the morning, like 9 a.m. probably. And then for the Saturday challenge, it's not a great time for Japan, from what I know. And it's a little bit of a rough time for Europe. So you end up with more of the American players and some of the European players and some of the more degenerate Japanese players. So you end up actually with like 2 different metagames a lot of the time on Saturday and Sunday, which is kind of fun to watch. So you get to see which each group is doing in terms of what they think where they should be pushing the metagame. And they don't always line up. Sometimes they line up. But maybe we want to look at one of each, actually. Now that I think about it like that, we can look at both and see if there was any differences. So obviously this is going to be a much smaller subsection of data. We're just going to look at the last challenge, and we're going to look at all of the decks that played in the challenge, and if the metagame lines up to what we're seeing as like a yearly trend, right? Over the last, I guess, half year, let's say. And so this is 1017. This is the Saturday Vintage Challenge from last weekend. What we're seeing are a pretty even field here, actually. We're seeing a large number of Shops players, a large number of Deathrite Shaman players, but still pretty large numbers of Bazaar, Xerox, and Combo. Win percentages for Bazaar were pretty low this weekend, whereas Combo and Shops actually had pretty reasonable numbers. And this is probably a deviation from the weekend before. I do believe that this weekend's data does have people who have got accounts from the Legacy event. So that may or may not play into who was playing this weekend. But I think that you want to look at the most recent data when you're looking at what maybe people will play in the next week, right? So when you go down a little bit more into the sub-archetype level, you're looking at no Ravager decks, right? All of these players are playing Golos, and they're doing fairly well. 54%, obviously a great win rate. These numbers will be like a much worse confidence interval than the 15,000 or 14,000 matches that we had to use for the data over here. Obviously, on a much smaller field, you can be way less confident about how accurate your data is. But you're seeing that from the Bazaar players, no Dredge pilots. 8 Hogaak pilots and 2 HollowVine pilots. The 2 HollowVine pilots didn't have a good time this weekend, but maybe that's just because there's only 2 of them. Tons of variability there. Among the Xerox players, 8 control decks. Among the Deathrite Shaman players, all bug. And then among the combo players, 5 DPS, 8 PO. Where the Doomsday players had a really rough time, and the PO players had a really great time. I post this. This should look a little familiar to anyone who follows on Twitter, because I post this every week. What I do is I'll post the top 32. I'll post the stats section, and I'll post the visualization of the stats section to give you kind of an easier look at the data, and you can really see here where your PO and your breach stand out from amongst the other players. Let's actually go back one more week and see how this data differs from the week before. 11. I don't have 1010. No one recorded data on 1010. So let's go to 10.3. So if you look back at 10.3, you'll see a very large field, 99 players, but you'll see somewhat similar of a distribution. You see way more combo this week and less Shops. So Shops Resurgent was more of a last weekend thing than anything else. Take a look at the win percentages. HollowVine had a very good weekend. Bazaar had a really good weekend. But I'm just really looking at the numbers right now, and I'm seeing like an extreme combo field. 12 Doomsday, 14 PO. And that is pretty represented in the 6 months data, right? We're seeing like a really high percentage of combo decks. This metagame percentage really mimics 10.3. 14, 15, 17, 27, 18, 13, 16, 17, 24, 14. It actually mirrors it almost exactly, which is why I was pretty surprised when I saw 1017's data that showed a high number of shops players, a low number of combo players for on average, right? And a pretty normal number of Deathrite Shaman players. So that's why I wanted to bring this up, because I do think this is interesting. From what I can tell from Twitter and the general feel of people that I've talked to who are not typically Magic Online Vintage players, I do think we will see more shops than normal, more Jeskai than normal, more Bizarre. I actually think that we maybe won't see the sheer number, but this could be untrue too. We could just see a huge number of combo players. I do know that, like, these are obviously my feelings and just how I've seen what happened for something like Gen Con and PAX. There was a large number of new players who wanted to play decks like PO and Doomsday. I don't know if I should have that data. Let's actually go take a look. Let's go take a look real quick. When was that? Was that September? That's NYC PAX Championship. Let's take a look at the PAX data real quick. So this is a God account, but this is the one that you have to qualify for, so it's a really small field. But if you look at this field, high number of shops, high number of combo, low number of Bizarre and Xerox. So anyways, I just wanted to bring that up as a talking point. It's really hard to predict what a field that is going to be this large is going to look like, right? When I'm looking at this kind of data, I'm looking at a lot of people who just play Vintage every week. Magic Online players playing Vintage every week are a small number of players, and they're a consistent number of players. They're usually the same players over and over every week. So when you're going to introduce, 400 new players to a metagame, it's going to be really interesting and really hard to predict what people are going to show up with. So this data, this is the last Sunday. It looks actually a little similar to normal with a lower number of shops than the surge. But maybe that's because more Western shops players. It's hard to tell, right? It's too small to make a huge difference. Anyways, I just wanted to show that because I thought that was interesting. It's pretty hard for me to predict. If I had to predict, I think we're going to see a lot of shops, a lot of bug, and a lot of combo. And maybe we do see a rise in some of the other decks, make a Jeskai. But those will be players who are trying to metagame against, if you're seeing a lot of bug, right? Maybe Jeskai's a good option. So that's the overview of the data that I have and what I'm looking at for the decks and how I'm feeling. Let's go look at actual decks themselves and maybe pick out a list or two and see what they're trying to do and which list I would recommend from those. Let's see. So let's start with everybody's favorite Tarmogoyf. Of the Deathrite Shaman decks, I actually don't have a good grasp on how much better Sultai is compared to 4-color. Maybe somebody in chat who has played both has some insight. Does anyone in chat have feelings regarding the Deathrite Shaman category? How do they feel regarding Sultai versus 4-color? So I think the list that I recommend from the Sultai is actually this Venom one. Let me just look real quickly at some of these other lists. 3 Tarmogoyf, 3 Leovold, 2 Collector Oof, 2 Oko, 2 Collector Oof, 3. So these are pretty stock lists. I think this list looks pretty stock. I was pretty happy when I saw this list. I think this list is a decent way to go about it. So this is just your challenge winning list. So then your challenge winning list is in a good place. This is somewhat of how I think you might want to play Bug. With a high number of creatures that are good against PO. I think if you go into the Bug matchup, the Bug versus PO matchup, expecting you're always going to win as the Bug player, you're going to be not very happy. You need to respect the PO matchup and play enough permanents that really hate on the PO matchup. So I actually think this is a pretty good starting place for anyone who likes Bug. I actually don't think that 4-color is the way to go if you're playing Deathrite Shaman log, so I don't think I'm even going to go into that. So Venom 1, which might be Jake's challenge list ripped off from a few weeks ago. I don't know for sure. I don't keep track of the iterations of Bug super closely. But this is actually what most Bug lists are looking like right now. Multiple Oko, 4 Assassin's Trophy, no Preordain, which kind of, in my mind, separates it from the Jeskai list and separates it from those lists. A decent number of Tarmogoyfs, but obviously a high number of hate creatures in Collector Roof and Leovold. And the reason that these decks are strong, obviously, is something that we talked about before. You're very good against Bazaar when you're playing 4 Wasteland and a Strip Mine along with Deathrite Shaman. You're playing 4 more Assassin's Trophies. Those also kill Bazaars. So you can play Preordain 79, but you don't have to. Or you don't typically. Because this deck is actually more of a mid-range deck, whereas the decks that are playing for Preordain are more of a control deck. Yama asks, is it me or Bug trash? I personally, now this is my personal opinion, I think Bug is not the thing I would be doing in Vintage. And the reason being is it's not doing anything inherently powerful. Now, is Bug a bad deck? No. You can't say it's a bad deck, specifically, like, you really can't argue with the data, right? Like, the data is showing that Bug is winning, and Bug is winning at a high percentage. One of the highest percentages among the decks that we have recorded. Yes, Lord Beerus, it casts Ancestral, but it casts far less Ancestrals than Jeskai. It doesn't play Mystic Sanctuary because it's on a Wasteland plan. It doesn't play Dreadhorde Arcanist. So you actually end up casting Ancestral only max 1 time. If you can cast Ancestral once, but your Jeskai opponent can cast Ancestral 5 times, like, there's a really big gap there. So I actually think Bug is a really divisive deck. People either love it or hate it. Personally, I think it's kind of embarrassing to play Tarmogoyf when you can be doing more powerful things. But that being said, Tarmogoyf has a lot of upsides in the current format of Vintage. When you look at Tarmogoyf and you play it against something like, when your opponent is making free 4/4s and they're playing these Vengevines and you just plop down a 4/5, 5/6, 6/7 Tarmogoyf, they can't do anything. This deck does nothing. This deck has to have one of their 4 Force of Wills to get rid of, or to allow the Tarmogoyf not to be in play, or it has to go, wide around the Tarmogoyf. So as much as I will, kind of jab at Tarmogoyf for not being a powerful enough card, it obviously has its place in the metagame because it's seeing play and doing well at the same time. Yo, what is up, Ben? Thanks for joining us. You played a lot of Bug, I'm sure. By I'm sure, I mean I know. Let's see what people are saying. I mean, it is a fast clock. It is not the fastest clock log. I think it's actually at its best when it's a wall against hollow ones. I think that's where Tarmogoyf really shines. The fact that it is a clock or a wall is kind of a difference maker, right? Jacob thinks Bug is overrated and 4-color is better. I just haven't seen any 4-color that can prove that point. And it might be true, but I can't prove that point in any meaningful way. You've played 45 matches with Bug, and how do you feel? You feel like it's good, Ben? I'm interested to hear what you say. I'd love to hear what you have to say about Bug. I mean, yeah, but 70% win rate is, you're a powerful wizard, so you're going to have a high win rate. I want to know how you feel. Do you feel like the deck was doing powerful things? Do you feel like it was uniquely situated to beat the other decks in the format? Because I don't feel like the deck does powerful things, but I do feel like it plops itself right in a place where you can battle. So if you wanted to play this deck and you like playing Jund, you like playing Grixis, you like playing fair, mid-range, shady control decks, I think this is the one where I would start. I would start on this list, which, like Jake said, might be Jake's list, might be someone else's list. This is very a stock Bug list, and I would tune it, right? I wouldn't just take this list and run it, but if you wanted a starting point, this is where I would start. So yeah, that's Bug. I don't really have that much to say about Bug because it's not really my style. I would much prefer to be doing more powerful things with my deck, but I can't deny the numbers that Bug is putting up, right? And this has happened before, and it's something that Matt brought up in the most recent Goldfish article. The last time Bug was extremely good was when Bazaar and Shops were extremely good. It ended up creating a very polarizing metagame where the Bug's decks was trying to keep the two. People were playing Bug not because that Bug was like so crazy deck, but it was because it was the best deck that beat both Shops and Dredge at the time. I think it was Dredge at the time. And maybe something like that is appearing again because of how good Bazaar is. Maybe because of how good Bazaar is, Bug is being propped up by how good Bazaar is, and that's probably true. That's kind of a reoccurring theme that's happened a couple times in the past couple of years. if you were to like lower the power level of the Bazaar decks, would Bug still be one of the better fair decks? I would tend to think not. And the reason I say that is because I think Bug does a pretty poor job against the other fair blue decks, right? Chat can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say Jeskai is pretty heavily favored versus Bug. Would Chat agree? Would Ben agree? Jake agree? Not heavily favored, but favored. That's fair. Yeah, so that's my understanding, right? And I'm gonna give my understandings, but feel free to correct me because, as I said, I'm not a Tarmogoyf caster. I haven't cast too many of them. So, unless people have any more questions specifically on Bug, we'll move on to the next deck. But I'm down to field some questions if anyone has any more questions about Bug. So the consensus is if you want to play Bug, you want to play a Jund deck, you want to play a Grixis kind of fair deck, that kind of style of deck, it's perfectly acceptable. I don't think it's a bad choice. It's not a choice I would make, but I don't think you're going to be hampered by your decision in deck selection if you choose a deck like this. All right. So that's a good starting point for Bug. Let's take a look at something else. PO. Now that's something I know a lot about. That's something I know a lot about. Let's find... I know what list I want to find. I want to find the 10 Bryant Cook list. So this is your stock PO list in 2020, as much as I loathe to say it. Bryant has put up a lot of consistent results with it, and I think it's the more likely deck you'll see if you play against a PO deck. This is a very... no, I mean, historically, before Bryant was playing a lot of vintage, you would see a red PO list and you would attribute it to the Power 9. But I would say recently the innovations inside of this list have definitely been under Bryant's wing, comparatively. So yes, it's a Bryant or, a historically maybe a P9 style, Pyroblast PO deck. And this is actually the list that I recommend to newer players who definitely want to play a powerful combo deck like PO. They're drawn to the idea of play a bunch of Moxen, pick up all my Moxen, spam I am actually PO in chat. Those kind of those kind of players. I think that this deck is actually not uniquely. I think it's better suited for a wide-ranging field. And I think it plays a more even game. And I think it plays a more straightforward game than something like Esper PO, which is a deck that I typically play. If you ever see my versions of PO that I post that I do well with, they don't look like this. So the reason is because there's a couple of reasons. I don't like Pyroblast in PO. My biggest problem is Pyroblast isn't as good at protecting your PO as a card like Flusterstorm. So my Pyroblast can't counter my opponent's Pyroblast, and my Pyroblast can't counter my opponent's Flusterstorm. My Pyroblast can only counter my opponent's Force. And so I actually don't like it, because it ends up being more of a reactive card than a proactive card, and as a combo player, as a PO player, I would rather play a more proactive game. The other thing is, I don't really like having Volcanic Island in my deck. I want to have as many islands as I possibly can, because I personally think that the Ghost Quarter Assassin's Trophy metagame dictates we want more islands. I can pull up one of my lists so you can see the differences. Another thing is my lists typically are not as flat against the metagame. I typically am looking at certain matchups and going a little heavier. How do I find my list here? I go to I am actually level 1. I don't want to show you guys my actual Esper list for the weekend, but if we look at something like NYSE, that's a good one. This is my second place list from NYSE. This is, there are some experimental cards like Karn and Grim that you probably want to ignore. But your real big difference is you're going to look at things like 2 snow-covered islands. You're playing things like Repeal. And you're just not looking to stretch your mana with Volcanic Island. And I don't think it's that big of a stretch, right? I say all these things, but I don't think the difference is very large. It's just a personal preference thing and something that I'm very accustomed to after a lot of reps. I do actually think that this is probably the better deck. How do I say this? It's a deck that I would recommend this deck more than the Esper deck. And I think this deck sometimes plays a better and more straightforward than the Esper deck. Like this deck, the Sprite Dragon sideboard plan, I think is really ingenious. It's something that has occurred in PO sideboards before. For example, last Eternal Weekend, I made a Rug PO list, which put 2 players into the top 8. This was during the Narset metagame. That deck played 4 Mana Gorger Hydra in its sideboard. This Sprite Dragon fills a similar role, but it lets you pivot your game plan where you don't have to be as combo centric. You can actually play this kind of tempo Delver strategy with the Sprite Dragons, and I actually think that lends you to have more flat matchups. Whereas if you're playing this Esper version, you don't have this backup win con or alternate plan, right? You have to do the PO things. You have to do Tinker. You have to do PO Yogg-Will. You have to cast those spells to win. You can't just play a Sprite Dragon and protect it. It means like your decisions are a little bit more volatile, and they are not always the most straightforward. And this is my opinion. And this is not by any means facts. And so when people ask me for PO lists, in general, I recommend them to take the latest Bryant list, because I do know how much work he puts into these and the thoughts behind his individual card choices, and I actually find that really impressive. Every single slot in here is calculated in the sideboard maps, and it's really important. That's funny, joke show. So this is the PO list that I would recommend someone play if they wanted to play PO. I think this list is super tuned. You definitely want to play the balance to help against the Hogaak strategies. I don't know about. I like his 3-3. I think it's 3-3 Pyroblast Flusterstorms. You could even play less Pyroblast and more Flusterstorm. I know that's something he's experimenting with. Personally, like, I'm not a huge Teferi fan, but I know that Bryant is. So if you want to see my Esper PO list, if you tune in Saturday at 3 a.m. Eastern time for the first Vintage Challenge, first Vintage Eternal Weekend event, I will be streaming my Esper PO list. And if I do well, maybe you might want to copy my Esper PO list for the weekend. I don't know. But it won't be, so far removed from this idea that it's super crazy. But now I've talked about the lists themselves a little bit. What is PO really doing? What is PO doing against the field? PO is slightly unfavored versus Sultai, depending on the build, but you are absolutely not. It's absolutely a winnable matchup. When I went to Italy with Ben and Joe Brennan, and we played a bunch of Vintage, I played tons and tons of matches versus Joe's Eternal Weekend deck, Eternal Weekend winning bug lists, and it was a lot closer than we initially imagined. I mean, you play a pretty big range of decks, Yama, so I'm sure you can find something you like. So the nicest part about PO is that the deck is so powerful that you are never in a position where you go into a matchup and you can't win. Paradoxical Outcome, the strategy, might be the most powerful Vintage strategy on just a sheer, like, in a vacuum power level thing that you can be doing. It might fall behind Doomsday. I'm not 100% on that one, but the real thing about PO is that you play 3 routes to victory, kind of 4 routes to victory. Your main route to victory is by casting a Tinker and putting a Bolas Citadel in play, and then just playing your whole deck. Or you can play a bunch of Moxen, cast PO, chain POs, and eventually win that way. Sometimes your POs and things get countered, so you're just casting a game-winning Yawgmoth's Will. And then also some games you might just deploy an early Monastery Mentor and ride that to victory. And I think Tinker Bolas Citadel is probably the most powerful play you can make in Vintage. The amount of times that you lose the game when you resolve Tinker Bolas Citadel is very small. And you build your deck in a way that you try to minimize any possibilities of losing the game from there. So that is the reason you would play PO. You want to play a combo deck that is actually playable versus every deck in the field. Now, you're not favored versus every deck in the field. You might be favored against Golos, but you might be slightly unfavored versus Doomsday. You might be favored slightly versus Hogaak, or maybe it's favored a lot versus Hogaak. This one's kind of a contentious choice because Hogaak does have a lot of sideboard hate for PO. But if you build your PO deck with respect to the sideboard hate of Hogaak, I think you can make it so it's pretty reasonable. You're going to be unfavored versus Jeskai, but you never can't win against Jeskai. Like, the biggest problem with PO is decks that are playing main deck Pyroblast, and those decks exist, right? Jeskai, Breach, Rug. Pyroblast, the card, is extremely, extremely good versus PO because almost every threat in your deck is blue. You're playing 4 PO and a Tinker, and those are your main routes to victory, and they are all blue and all get countered by 1 red Pyroblast. So this is like your worst matchup, but by all means, it's not an unwinnable matchup. You will definitely have hands that can play versus Jeskai. And if you time your POs right, end step PO into a PO on your turn, playing good combo gameplay where you're forcing them to be tight on mana, tight on counters, and forcing them into an unfavorable situation, you actually can play a reasonable game versus this. I actually think that PO is a great deck versus the bizarre matchups. Dredge in particular, you typically are pretty happy playing against Dredge. Breach is a little rough because of the PO, but it's still the bottom line I'm trying to say here is that your PO deck is a pretty flat deck where you can play against everything in the field because the power level is so high. I can't stress enough how busted Tinker Bolas Citadel is. It is really, really, really dumb. Actually, Bryant came out with some stats the other day on the Discord that I thought were incredibly interesting, and they're a little light on data, but it's from his leagues playing PO. About half of his games are won via Tinker Bolas Citadel, and this is a big reason why I don't really buy a lot of people's arguments towards PO restriction. The best thing you can be doing in your PO deck is not casting PO; it's just going for Tinker. The PO gives you an alternative use for all of these mana sources, these mana rocks that you're going to Tinker. But the best play you can make is still always going to be Tinker. So just something to think about. That one always gets to me a little bit, but it's a Tinker deck with a PO plan, not a PO deck with a Tinker plan. So I will take questions on PO right now. I realized that this kind of didn't go the way I wanted it to. It kind of ended up being more of an in-depth look on the decks in the metagame rather than an overview of how the decks play, which is unfortunate, but it's different content. I was hoping I would make something that was a little bit more low to the ground for newer players for the format, but hopefully there's still something to glean here for them. We'll have to see. I might have to go back and look at it and see if I need to do another recording at some point, maybe. I just don't have very much time. So, can we ban Tinker? Well, I can't do that. No. I'm actually level 1. I'm new to Vintage. What is the Sprite Dragon sideboard plan for? Good question, Micah. So, I actually highly recommend you check out Bryant's VODs. So there's a really good 10-0 challenge where Brian plays against a good amount of decks, and you can actually see how he plays. If anyone has that link to Bryant's 10-0 challenge and it can link it to Micah, that would be really, really awesome. The sideboard plan is when you need to pivot when your main plans are not very good. I don't always agree with the places that Bryant brings in Sprite Dragon, but that's the idea. It's on YouTube. Should be on his YouTube. I think it's the Epic Storm. I'm not 100% sure. I believe I retweeted it, so it might be on my Twitter too. I just don't want to spend too much time looking for it. So some of the matchups are things I think like the Hollow One decks. You bring in Sprite Dragon. Those are hard. Sprite Dragon is a hard card for Hollow One to answer and quickly grows out of the range where that Hollow One can race it. What are other decks where he brings in Sprite Dragon? Trying to remember. I don't have a list of the decks. Okay, awesome. I would highly recommend, if you want to know how Bryant sideboards with this deck, if you just go to a match and jump right to sideboard, you can figure out when he's bringing in Sprite Dragons. Because I don't want to put words, in his mouth on how to play his sideboard plans. So I would highly recommend you check out his VODs and see if you can find the information there. What matchups do you bring in Blightsteel? So the main place you bring in Blightsteel is matchups where the opponent has Force of Vigor. So yeah, it's the 10. I don't know if 10-10. It's whatever this one is actually. This date 10-10. Yeah, 10-10 challenge. Oops. 10-10 challenge. Yeah. So hopefully someone's linked that to you in the chat, Micah. But I would definitely recommend checking that out. So Hypno asked, when do you bring in Blightsteel? And the answer is you bring it in against Force of Vigor decks or Shops decks. So I would definitely be bringing in Blightsteel versus Shops. They don't have a very good way to answer a Blightsteel, whereas their Sphere effects will stop your Bolas Citadel plan. You want to bring in a Blightsteel versus your Bazaar opponents. They don't have a very good way of dealing with a Blightsteel. And sometimes they can Force of Vigor your Bolas Citadel. Sometimes when you play against your Bazaar opponents, you might keep in both. And if they don't have a Force of Vigor, and you know they don't have a Force of Vigor, you might go for a Citadel. But sometimes versus those like HollowVine opponents, your Citadel might start at a lower life total and might not be as effective, right? So you want a Blightsteel there. You would bring it in against something like White Eldrazi, other creature matchups. You might want to consider not playing Blightsteel at all and playing a Sphinx of the Steel Wind in your sideboard. Sphinx of the Steel Wind lines up a little bit better versus Hollow One and the Vengevine decks and the Dak decks and the Oko decks, but lines up a little worse against Shops and Dredge. There's some options there. But the main idea of a Blightsteel is to supplement your Tinker plan when a Bolas Citadel is not really ideal, right? So if for some reason you're lower on health, if for some reason you're taxed on your spells, or if for some reason your opponent might have Force of Vigor. Those are the real big reasons. Typically, you used to like Blightsteel a lot in the Bug matchup because they don't have Dak Fade in. They used to have like Jace the Mind Sculptor, but now that they have Oko, it's a little bit more difficult. You probably still want the Blightsteel in the Bug matchup, but you probably might want to keep both the Blightsteel and the Bolas Citadel. So there's a little bit of options and a little bit of nuance to when and when you don't want the Blightsteel, but for the most part, you just need to think like, why would I bring in Blightsteel? Well, when Bolas Citadel is bad. Why would Bolas Citadel bad? Well, for all the reasons we just listed, right? You don't really want to bring in Blightsteel against a deck that plays Dak Faden. So something like 4-color Deathrite Shaman, you probably don't want to bring in your Blightsteel. You probably want to stick with your Bolas Citadel. Even though they play Force of Vigor and Assassin's Trophy, they also still play Dak Fadens and Okos. You don't want to tinker a Blightsteel and have your opponent take it from you for 3 mana. It's not a good feeling. Let's see. Were there any other questions? How hard is it to learn PO? How much does the average novice pilot miss? So I actually think that the floor of PO is extremely high. So what I'm saying there is a novice pilot can pick it up and play it to a high power level. The lines in PO are fairly straightforward. You play your Moxen and you play your spells and you combo, right? If you want to learn a little bit more about how PO combos off, you can check out some of my videos on YouTube, or you can check out Bryant's videos on YouTube. Both of us have tons and tons of PO content. Just go find a playlist that contains a PO deck, and you can kind of see it. The main way, what you do is you play a bunch of Moxen, you cast your PO, you pick up your Moxen, you play a bunch of Moxen, you cast your PO, you draw extra cards, until you go through most of the cards in your deck, and you play a Monastery Mentor plus a Time Walk. Now, there's some other ways you win from there that involve like sack 10 permanents to Bolas Citadel, return them all with Yogg-Will, sack 10 permanents to Bolas Citadel. And there obviously are like more challenging lines when, like, say you don't have a mentor anymore, or you can't find your mentor in time, or that kind of thing. But I think that the base level play for PO will still be a really high output. One of the things you might miss when you start out playing PO is Sensei's Divining Top. The trick that Not Me is mentioning in chat is if you tap your top holding the control button on Magic Online, hope it's the control button. I just do that on reflex. Control button? Probably the control button. Hold priority, tap your top, and then cast PO targeting all your Moxen and your top. What will happen is you will resolve your PO first, picking up your top and all your Moxen, and then you will resolve your Sensei's Divining Top activation, which instead of drawing a card and putting top on top, it just draws a card because there's no top to put on top. That is a problem for newer players, is they play a little slow and maybe they don't know how to sideboard. That is true, Cho. I would say that's a reasonable point. If you don't know how to sideboard with PO, the best thing I can do is, because I've suggested this deck list, I think you should just go watch Brian's sideboarding. I would go to his playlist. I would go jump to sideboard, and like he has it listed, he's playing against Hogaak. So you jump to the sideboard and you see how he boards versus Hogaak, and he does a very good job of explaining why he's doing that as well. It's hard. Explaining sideboarding in Vintage is a little hard for me because I sometimes get caught in the trap of like, you should know this already kind of thing. But obviously, a lot of people are new. But if you're struggling with sideboarding for PO, I highly recommend just jumping to sideboards and matches. So my PO leagues are up on my YouTube. Like, let me find a good one actually. There's a really good one that I highly recommend. It'll be a different deck list, but the idea should be similar. Let's go find it. So you have the Bryant one, but there's also, where is the championship? What is it called? Mox? Showcase? Showcase Championship here. So this is my my walkthrough and analysis of my showcase win. So this PO deck is very different from the deck, this Bryant list. It's very fine-tuned for a certain metagame, but I go into a really detail on why and I'm doing the sideboarding I'm doing. So I think that's a pretty good video to watch, even if the list is a little bit more it's a little bit more specific. So this is a pretty good example of my how I play or how I change my Esper lists. So if you look at this Esper list, right, you're playing some crazy cards like Mystic Remora and Mindbreak Trap, but I'm doing this for a very specific reason. That's to target a very small metagame. So this list doesn't help you as much. Like, I don't recommend you play this list because this list is directly for a 20-person tournament where most of the players are going to play blue. Bryant's list, I think, is very good against a field that is a diverse field. It might be, Bryant's list is a little weaker than I'd like to Bazaar, but that's a personal thing. You are actually pretty favored versus Bazaar in general as the PO player, so it's not a huge deal. So right. So that's why I'm not going out of my way to tell people to play an Esper list that I made, is because I typically find my Esper lists to be a little bit more pointed at a metagame, whereas I think that this list was a little bit more better for the field. So, all right, I think I've talked enough about PO, unless people have any more questions about PO that I can help answer. Oh boy. Golos stacks. Not a fan. Not a fan. Who's the best PO pilot? Ooh, that's a dangerous question. I would have to say myself. And then I would say the Power 9. And then I would say, at least for now, Bryant, I would say. If you had asked me before I had start winning a lot, I would have said the Power 9 was the best. But I'm feeling pretty good about myself right now. I'm pretty happy with how we've played recently. I have a lot of respect for both. I have a lot of respect for the Power 9 and a lot of respect for Bryant. So by all means, a bunch of powerful wizards for sure. I don't think the Power 9 is washed up, but he's a filthy Jeskai player now, so P9 is an extremely strong wizard for sure. Anyways, let's move on past that. Let's just do Golos stacks. Yeah, I believe almost it's extremely likely Power 9 will play Jeskai for this weekend. Yeah, he's abandoned the PO team. All right, so Golos Stacks is a Mishra's Workshop deck that revolves around locking your opponent out with Sorcerer's Spyglass, Crucible of Worlds, Strip Mine, Wasteland, Ghost Quarter, locking the under a sphere of resistance, and eventually killing with things like Stone Coil Serpent, Golos, and Phyrexian Revoker. Golos allows you to play a little bit of a tutor game where you can tutor for things like Avengers Fair, Caracas, Strip Mine, Tabernacle, and execute these game plans with a little bit more toolbox nature. So, Bob, I actually recommend you play whatever you think that you would play the best, right? I think that most of these top decks I think all of these top decks will give you a chance to win. I don't think any top deck is really, gonna pigeonhole you into a bad place. Sorry, I'm kind of losing, I'm losing my voice a little bit here. I don't usually have to talk this much. I should probably get some more water, but instead I'll just drink more beer, right? So I actually think you should find a deck, Bob, that matches the way you like to play Magic and practice that. So like if you like to play artifacts or aggro decks, then maybe you want to play Ravager. If you like to play, mid-range fair decks like Jund in Modern, you might want to play Sultai. If you like to play combo decks, you might want to play PO or Doomsday. If you're a graveyard person, you might want to play one of the Bazaar decks. So I don't think any of the decks are so easy that you just should play it because it's an easy deck to play. All of them have some amount of learning curve to them. So I actually think it's better for you to play a deck you think you would enjoy, than to pigeonhole on something that you might not. So going back to talking about Golos shops, this is the premier shops list right now. I personally not a big fan of it. I don't think it closes out the game nearly as fast enough. I think it's really slow, and I'm not a huge fan of its game plan against the field. Obviously, the deck has put up decent numbers. You look at this challenge right here: 3rd, 5th, 18th, 19th, 21st, 25th, 30th, 31st. Like those are pretty reasonable placings. And people seem to like it. I'm not a huge fan, but it is doing powerful things because it is playing Mishra's Workshop. This card is obviously absurd. Being able to play 3 mana every turn for your spells is very, very, very good. So, I don't play this deck. I don't play it very much, so I don't have very much insight for the players who have any questions about it, other than this is your prison deck. This is your premier prison deck. Also your premier workshop deck. As much as I don't think it's the best workshop deck you could choose this weekend. So I wouldn't recommend playing this over playing something like Ravager if you wanted to play workshops. But if you wanted to play a prison deck, this is probably your best choice. This deck really hinges on mulligan decisions and kind of like a Tron deck in Modern. And it really hinges on your sequencing, on which spells you play first. And I don't know I don't know the good sequencing, so I can't really enlighten you. Hopefully someone could point you to a shops expert to do so. But yeah, I don't know if that's true. Scriggles, I really think that there's a chance that Ravager's being a little undervalued right now, but obviously the data shows that it's not having a great time for sure. This deck obviously wants you to be on the play more often than not. You're not playing Force of Will, so if your opponent just like turn 1 POs you and you're on the draw, you're going to have a bad time, right? But obviously, Workshop Trinisphere is an easy way for any player to win the game. If you keep a hand that has Mishra's Workshop and Trinisphere, you cast it and it resolves, and your opponent is not also playing Mishra's Workshops, you have a very high likelihood to win the game. So there is a lot of upside to doing, this kind of deck. If anyone has any questions on this deck, they can ask them in chat. I can't guarantee I will have a good answer for you, but I can try to explain, about how the deck plays or how a deck plays a certain matchup. I can give it my best shot, but as I said, I'm not an all-knowing being. I only can play the decks I can play, and this one is not one of the decks that I can play very well. So let's just give a second to see if chat has anything they want to ask. Hey, man. It's better that I say that I don't know what I'm talking about than to act like I know what I'm talking about and give you false information. True or false, Matt? True or false? I can't tell you how to have a shop in your opening hand. If you've seen any of my shops videos on YouTube, you'll know that I have a very hard time in finding a shops in my opening hand. Unless it's KCI. And in that case, we have a good time. No shops for you. All right, well, we'll just move to the next one. Now, this is a deck I actually know about, so this is good. HogaakVine. Now, this is actually my second choice for the weekend, personally. I love playing this deck. I think this deck is super... What the hell is this? This is not what I want. What the fuck is this? This is what I want. I am actually level 1. This is actually my recommended list for the weekend for Hogaak. I think the only change I would recommend... I'm not sure if this forest is better than a swamp, but then if it is better than a swamp, we have to change some of our land base. So this is HogaakVine. This is one of the Bazaar decks. This is a Bazaar deck where you don't have to mulligan to a Bazaar every time. Now, you do want a Bazaar in your opening hand. So you do want to evaluate your hands on if they have a Bazaar. It's probably a keep. Or if you can play an early Hogaak, and by early I mean turn 2, then that might also be a keep. You can keep hands that have creatures and spells and have a once upon a time after you've started mulliganing a little bit. This deck plays a little bit more fairly than a classic Bazaar Baghdad Dredge deck. And you have a really large range of keeps, which is really cool for a Bazaar deck, because typically a Bazaar deck has a very small range of keeps, which include, does it have Bazaar? This is not the case here. You can easily play a game where you play a turn 1 Deafening Silence post board, turn 2 Oof, and then like slowly play hard cast Vengevines and kill your opponent while locking them out. Some kind of a Hate Bears style plan. But this deck is, while it is a creature aggro deck, it also does have this unfair element where you can put tons and tons of free power into play. If you're interested in this deck at all, I highly recommend checking out my latest challenge that would be on the state on the 17th. Let me bring up that playlist for chat. I can send that to you. I actually think that this video is very good. I think we made a lot of pretty reasonable plays in this deck, in this list, where we did interesting things and good teaching moments as well. So I linked a YouTube playlist in chat. If you are interested in this deck, I highly recommend just watching that whole playlist. Secret tech for watching playlists on Twitter. Oh, sorry, on YouTube. Watch it at 2 times speed. You don't have all day. Maybe you do have all day, but let's just act like you don't have all day. You don't want to listen to me talk for 5 hours. Make it 2.5. Make it 2 times speed. I think I'm pretty... I think you can understand what I'm saying at 2 times speed. If you can't, maybe turn it down to 1.5. But that way you can get more content in less time, right? I think this deck is super cool, and for the reasons I said, where you do get to play Wastelands, so you can deny your opponent. You get to play tons of free things with HollowVine, Vengevine, Bloodghast. Your Hogaaks are really easy to put into play with Stitcher Supplier, fetching Dryad Arbor, putting free Root Walls into play. And then the most recent changes is you have I like to play the blue restricted cards, the Power 9, Ancestral Recall, and Time Walk in my deck. You don't have to play Ancestral Recall and Time Walk. You could play a non-blue version and put like 2 Collector Roofs in here. Perfectly reasonable. Yeah. So let's see if I can find a better a non-blue version that you can look at. What does this one look like? So this is what maybe a more stock list looks like. This one plays Cabal Therapy. You have about 2, maybe 3 flex slots in this deck. I've seen Cabal Therapy. I've seen Life from the Loam. I've seen Crop Rotation. I've seen the blue spells. There's a lot of... I've seen Collector Oofs. You have a lot of choices in these. You don't have a lot of choices in your deck. The deck build requires you to have a certain number of pieces to function, because it is a deck that is a synergy-based deck. But your 3 flex slots actually are super flexible because they're not really part of your engine, so it depends on what you want to do with them. I recommend Collector Oof or blue spells, but I think Cabal Therapy is certainly reasonable here. There's some plus side to things like Life from the Loam, because we are in a very wasteland heavy metagame right now. I'll get to Ravager. I'm gonna get to Ravager. I think Ravager's worth talking about for sure. So yeah, you do end up playing a lot of permanent based hate in the board, things like Deafening Silence, Chalice, Collector Oof. which allows you to play a better matchup against things like PO or Doomsday post board. You might play Mindbreak traps to help you with those matchups. And then you also play, a bunch of graveyard hate because you're gonna face other graveyard decks. When I'm talking about blue spells, I'm talking specifically about Ancestral Time Walk. Mindbreak Trap is obviously a free spell, but you can cast it. I have hard cast it. Some of the blue versions will play Flusterstorms in the board. I don't recommend that. I think it's really hard to have a blue mana open. I actually do think that my list is quite good here. I don't think the sideboard is perfectly mapped out, and I might want more Collector Oofs somewhere. But I think the idea behind a forest in the main is quite good right now, or a swamp if you retool your mana base. And I do think the idea of these blue spells as your flex slots is actually really, really good. That's my opinion. We don't know for sure what the stock list of Hogaak will end up being, but all the lists are fairly similar. Like I said, they only play 2 or 3 flex slots. No, Jacob, we're not. I'm sorry. We already talked about your winning bug list. What more do you need from us? Now, like I said, I think that if you have questions about the HogaakVine deck, I think that the challenge VOD does a really good job of showing you sequencing and play patterns and sideboarding. But if you have any more questions right now, feel free to ask in chat before we move to the next deck. Like I said, it's a really cool deck. It has some interesting sequencing lines. It lets you play through hate really, really well. It's pretty cool to be able to see your opponent go leyline, surgical, all your things, and then you're just like, well, I played a Deathrite Shaman and a Bloodghast, and I hardcast this Vengevine. Can you beat my dudes? And they just can't. So I would consider Hogaak to be favored versus Bug, but I know people don't agree with that all the time. But from my experience with Hogaak, I do like the Bug matchup. I actually think the Jeskai matchup's a little bit harder because of Swords to Plowshares, which is interesting to me. But it's okay. You get to play 4 Force of Vigor, and you can play your spells through a little bit of hate. You have at least some lands to play. I know it sometimes can be hard to play against Golos, and you have to kind of rely on your creatures instead of your Bazaar plan. But I think it's reasonable versus Shops. I don't know who's really favored in that matchup, but I do think it's a battle that you can win and a battle you can lose. I think the Bug matchup is close. I personally have had a lot of success versus the Bug decks, but I could see it being close. I think this deck actually fares really well versus the field. The place where it really struggles is Doomsday. I think the Doomsday matchup is a little rough. Personally, I think the PO matchup is not as good as people think it is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with all the things that chat is saying, even though some of the things that chat is saying is conflicting. I mean, I'm pretty happy versus the Bug matchup. I know some people aren't, but I do think that this deck plays pretty well against Bug. I think of your Bazaar decks, this is easily the best one against Bug. I think that Bug eats HollowVine, and Dredge alive. So so we're going into this next tournaments, right? Assuming there's going to be a lot of Bug. That's the assumption we have based on recent metagame data. If I had to pick a Bazaar deck, this kind of seems like the one I would pick. Easily has the best matchup versus Bug, and that's my opinion. But personally, I think that because I do actually like playing HollowVine as well, but I think this one has a better matchup versus the top decks in the field right now. So we can get there. But if I had to choose, I definitely would prefer to play HogaakVine versus the field. For sure. You have to always account that people have some amount of bias in many different ways, right? You have a lot of people in chat who are, vintage regulars, and they have played a lot of matches, and they have opinions. I think the coolest example of vintage players having opinions is the latest Goldfish article. Maybe it's on the front page of Goldfish, but if you want to check it out, Vintage 101, the Vintage Roundtable, you have 6-7 players who have actually very different opinions about the format in general. And all of these players have a lot of experience and reason to have the views that they have, and they do differ a lot, which I think is pretty cool. So I think this article is really cool. So I'll link it in chat. You guys can check it out. This is one of Joe Dyer's articles on MTG Goldfish. Highly recommend his article series. They come out every week and they take a good look at what decks are being played in Vintage right now, and then loads of other topics. So did it fix that? Hold on. I want to see if we fixed it. King log. Screwing with my answers. Aha, it's gone now. Suck it, log. Wait, Mario, you know Raphael? Actually, so you actually see a lot of these people in chat right now. I'm here, obviously. Jacob is boss. Raphael is log. Mike Noble is Lovestruck Beast, I think, right now. I can never keep track of his names. And Matt Murray is Chubby Rain. So actually, a lot of these people are in chat right now, which is kind of cool. All right. We'll move on to the next deck, so I don't have to be here all night. I do need to get to bed at some point. All right, this is one of the most powerful decks in Vintage, in my opinion. I think a fantastic choice for the weekend if you are a combo-centric player. This is Doomsday. And Doomsday historically has a reputation of being an extremely hard deck to play. In the past, Doomsday decks were sometimes shunned away from by combo players because of the amount of thought needed to put together a Doomsday pile. Doomsday. Where you look through your yard and library and pick 5 cards, and that becomes your deck. That all changed when Thassa's Oracle attacked. This card is completely busted. I'm sure if you play any amount of Magic in any format, you will know that Thassa's Oracle is everywhere. This is just one of the most powerful combo cards to ever be printed, really. And it really streamlined your basic Doomsday packages. Like 80, I would say 80. I don't know if this is exaggeration. I would say 80% of your Doomsday piles will be Ancestral or Gush, followed by Black Lotus, Thassa's Oracle, and 2 other cards. And they don't really matter very much. A lot of times you will just go turn 2, Dark Ritual, Doomsday, make your Gush Thassa's Oracle, Black Lotus pile, Preordain into your Gush, cast your Gush, Lotus Oracle, your opponent is dead. And I don't know if that's an exaggeration on my end, but I do think that there's actually a pretty high floor to Doomsday, similar to PO, where it's very easy to understand what you need to do when an opponent has nothing. However, it does definitely get challenging when you have to start playing around cards. And actually, I learned that firsthand. I was a little overconfident, I would say. I played a Doomsday list in one of the Gen Con qualifiers, and I had a very hard time when my opponents were presenting disruption. And so while I think that this deck has a high floor, I do think you want to practice with it as much as you can, which is, well, that's a little late to start doing that, as it is Thursday before a Saturday event, but oh man, it is a strong deck, and I think it is a really powerful deck. It's one of the decks that has some of the highest win percentages right now. It's up around 54%. You'll see tons and tons of Doomsday top 8s and wins, specifically by players like Singpan Man and Discover N, 2 really powerful Japanese wizards. Cherry has had tons and tons of top finishes with Doomsday recently. As of super recently, Doomsday hasn't had the strongest finishes, but there was a section in the year where Doomsday was in every top 8, sometimes multiple times. I think people have adapted a little bit to it, learned to play against it a little bit better. But I do think it's still one of the strongest decks you can be playing. If you're a combo player, I definitely recommend playing PO or Doomsday. Or Breach, I guess. Sometimes I forget to associate Breach as a combo deck, but while I think that Doomsday is one of the most powerful decks, as Matt says, I do think that Doomsday is at one point in time I didn't think Doomsday was super beatable. But I do think that once you play against it enough, you'll start to see the openings, as it were. You'll see where you can pick your spots a little bit more clean, and you'll start to increase your win percentage versus Doomsday. Um, I don't have, any more super incredible insights about Doomsday. Like as I said, I played it a couple times. I played against it a ton. I do think that you're a deck that can really prey upon non-force of will decks. You're even a deck that preys upon force of will decks fairly well by playing, more free counter magic like Daze, and you're on like a mystical dispute sometimes, 3 Flusterstorms. You can really overpower your opponent's interaction, basically. Doomsday can struggle sometimes against decks that play permanent-based interaction, things like Lavinia, Deafening Silence, um, stuff like that. Yeah, LSV put out a Doomsday video today. I haven't watched it. I know some people had said that it wasn't the tightest play, but you can probably learn something by. I'm sure LSV learned a lot while playing the league, and maybe you can learn while following along as well. Obviously, LSV is one of the most talented players, so I'm sure that the growth over one league is probably visible. So, yeah, we'll move past that. But if you actually want to see a bunch of Doomsday VODs, I don't know if Cherry X-Men reposts to YouTube or if he has Twitch archives. I don't know if anyone in chat knows if Cherry has permanent links to any of his videos. Cherry has streamed a lot of Doomsday, and I actually think Cherry gives you a pretty good look into how to I think Cherry's improvement casting Doomsdays has been very visible to me, at least playing against him. So I think that you guys can follow along with that as well. I'm pretty happy with how he plays these days, because he was pretty new to the format at one point, and he pretty much played Doomsday nonstop for a while, and now he puts up like top 8s every so often, really, like pretty frequently. So I don't know if anyone in chat knows if he has any permanent links anywhere to content, but if you do have that knowledge, please drop it in chat so people can find it. I don't really think I have anything more to say on Doomsday. Well, we're talking about all kinds of lists, Luis, and I think the answer is you can play anything you'd like. Oh, look at that. We've got some Doomsday VODs. Not permanent, but at least some pretty recent Doomsday VODs. So, if you're in chat, you can check out those links and save those links. If not, you should be able to see them on the screen, or maybe go to Cherry X-Men _ Twitch channel when you're watching this on YouTube and see if you can find any VODs on there. So, we're gonna move past Doomsday and we're gonna go to Breach. This is Aegis's favorite deck. What the hell is that? All right, that's. Can I get a real Breach list? What am I looking at? Here's a Discover End list. That's got to be reasonable. This looks reasonable. So there's still a lot of contention out there on. Yeah, I like your lists. Let's go to your lists. Your list is a little old at this point, but it's not a bad one. That's the green list. I don't want the green list. I will show the green lists just to show that the difference, but I want to show the white list first. Okay, so there's about a million ways you can build this deck, which I think is pretty interesting. Underworld Breach is a card that is banned in Legacy, right? Someone tell me I'm wrong. Pretty sure it's banned in Legacy. And it plays like a control deck, but it has a combo finish, is the way I like to describe it. And you can build it in many ways. You can build it as a Grixis combo deck / control deck. You can build it as a 4-color featuring white plus Grixis, or you can even build it as a 4-color featuring green plus Grixis. I personally like both of these 4-color lists. I would rather play 4 colors than just Grixis, I think, in Breach. I think you get a little bit more options that way. I do think that Monastery Mentor is like an incredibly powerful card. I don't really know exactly what to say. The combo, for those who don't know, is you have an Underworld Breach and you brain freeze yourself, and then you recast your Black Lotus, and you brain freeze yourself, and you recast your Black Lotus, and you brain freeze yourself, and then you cast spells and brain freeze them. And then when they have 0 cards in their library, you could cast Ancestral or pass the turn or whatever. And obviously, there's a little bit of nuance to that, like how many cards do I have in yard so that I can escape? What kind of interaction can my opponent have? But in general, that's the combo. The combo is Brain Freeze and Underworld Breach, and then Lotus Petal or Black Lotus, depending on which one you have. You can have more cards in your yard to do the Lotus one, the Lotus Petal one, but you could easily do Black Lotus. Is the very easy one. I'm not. Yeah, exactly. So you will win some games just by being a Xerox control. You're Grixis / Jeskai control deck. You're playing your Dak Fate and your Narset and your Mentor, and you're just countering all their spells and playing a threat and winning by drawing more cards than your opponent. You have a Mystic Sanctuary and an Ancestral Recall, so you can just bury your opponent like that. But sometimes you just have a hand that's like Underworld Breach, Black Lotus, Brain Freeze. Oh, look, my opponent is dead on turn 1. And it gives you a really sense of, as the opponent of a Breach deck, it gives you a real sense of danger. It feels really scary when my opponent is like, all of a sudden, boom, I can die at any moment. Which gives you like some leverage that a normal Jeskai control deck or a Xerox deck doesn't really have. It also does typically play a Sprite Dragon pivot plan in the board, kind of like Bryant's 4-color PO list. When opponent starts to try to hate out your combo, you can bring in Sprite Dragons and pivot to a different axis of attack. What Lord Beerus is saying in chat is certainly a big deal. Because you're playing Brain Freeze as part of your Breach combo, Brain Freeze works incredibly well against Doomsday. When Doomsday puts down, their 5-card library, you can just Brain Freeze them and mill the 5 cards, and then they're dead. What is up, Gordon? Thanks for the follow or the sub. I don't actually know. One of the two. Either way, thanks for showing up. Thanks for hanging out. Yeah, I don't really know what more you can really say. It's a really solid deck. It's really well built to do its engine, which is the Xerox draw engine, but also the combo finish. Like I said, you can build it with white, where you get to play Mentor, Lavinia, and Teferi, or you could build it with green, where you get to play Mana Gorge or Hydra and Veil of Summer. Or you could just you miss the 4th color in general and just play a Grixis version like Discover in here and just play more blue, red, and black cards. I don't know if Aegis, do you think I'm missing anything key in discussing this deck? I think this deck is pretty strong versus the field. I think it's obviously its best matchup is this Doomsday matchup where you get to play Brain Freezes and really make your Doomsday opponent cry. You could play Jeskai. I mean, I wouldn't recommend Jeskai. I think you really want to play Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor. Those are really important cards. Sure, there's also a list where you play Oath of Druids and Breach combo in the same list, some kind of hybrid lists. But yeah, I would personally recommend one of the Grixis or 4-color variants. That's a really good point, not me. Sprite Dragon sideboard plan does let you play against Leyline of the Void, which is turn off your Breach plan. So I think the coolest part about this list is that the combo is actually really hard to hate. And the deck is doing something very powerful outside of the combo. So if opponent is all in on stopping your graveyard-based combo, you can really just bury them in Ancestrals and Mentor and these Planeswalkers and Sprite Dragons and really kind of ignore the hate, which is, I think, one of the best parts about this deck. Whereas PO is a deck that kind of folds to the hate, this is a deck that really thrives in playing around the hate. So if you like combo control, this is definitely the place to be. I recommend any list from Aegis. If it's from Aegis or Discover End, those are the players who I would recommend following their lists. Lenka's pretty reasonable. Let's take a look at Lenka's last list. This is a cool list that plays a Ren and 6 along with Mana Gorge or Hydra. Lenka has some interesting takes on Preach as well. So I would not recommend copying powerful Vintage Champion Bryant's lists, as they, well, as you can see, they do they do a lot of things 2 Force. It's a those are magic cards. Let me tell you, this is a 75 if I've ever seen one. I don't recommend copying him because unless your name is Brian Kelly, you are not going to win with a Brian Kelly list, and that's just how it works. Yeah, I love Brian Kelly's list, but oh my. All right, let's move on. We got a couple more to cover. I want to get through Jeskai, Dredge, Rug, HollowVine, and maybe Humans or Oath. Man, there's so many lists. Woo! Vintage is a pretty diverse format right now, which is really nice. There's a lot of playable decks, but that also means that the stream is already longer than I wanted it to be, which is fine. This is a really flexible deck. This is your control deck of the format. This is your Jeskai Arcanist is what it's typically called. Not that it plays a huge number of Arcanists, but your main game plan is really Ancestral Recall. You're going to try to cast as many Ancestral Recalls as possible. Cast Ancestral Recall, bring it back with Mystic Sanctuary. Cast Ancestral Recall, bring back your Mystic Sanctuary with Gush. Cast Ancestral Recall, flash it back with Dreadhorde Arcanist. I don't know what's the best list. Let's look at P9's list. That's a good place to start. So we were talking about P9 earlier, one of the most powerful Paradoxical Outcome players, also a very, very competent Jeskai pilot. I believe he either won or was in the finals of a Star City Power 9 event with Jeskai. I can't remember for sure. I'm not the best Jeskai historian, or not the best vintage historian. I am not a vintage historian as it is. But you can kind of see the layout here, right? We got restricted blue spells and Jeskai cards that supplement your restricted blue spells. You get to play Pyroblast in the main to beat these blue matchups. You're playing Swords to battle against the creatures of the format. You have a Shattering Spree to hedge against shops. And a bunch of counter magic and draw spells. You got powerful blue planeswalkers, Dak Vaden. The real key with Dak Vaden is you get to pitch the cards that are bad. So I'm playing against shops. I can steal their artifacts, or I can get rid of these Pyroblasts, which are not very good. As much as I don't like playing these decks, I do have a lot of respect for this deck. This deck is one of the decks that's best against PO. And obviously Dreadhorde Arcanist is an extremely powerful card. If you play any Legacy, you'll know how good this card is. Just think about flashing back an Ancestral Recall with this card. Free Ancestral Recall is the goodness, especially when you've already cast the Ancestral Recall that game, so maybe you've drawn 6 cards. Really hard for your opponent to come back from drawing 6 cards. Edgar asked, to me, Jeskai is underrated. You said it was a good head to match. You said it was good head up in the Xerox mirrors and the PO mirrors. Favored versus shops, better versus GAC than Bug is. What are you missing? It has an abysmal bizarre matchup typically, and I wouldn't say, I mean, it's like slightly favored versus shops. Like you're still not gonna always, it's got to be like 55 at best, and you have to really respect shops where you're playing your 4 Shattering Sprees. You can't just be like 4 Pyroblast and expect to beat shops kind of deal. Like you're not, I'm saying it's better versus shops than it used to be. Typically, these blue fair decks were really, really bad versus shops, whereas this deck, I think, is actually pretty reasonable matchup versus shops. Your biggest problem is, although I said that it's better than Bug is against GAC because of Swords to Plowshares, I don't think it's super good versus GAC. I think, in general, like, historically, this kind of deck is really bad versus, like, a Dredge matchup. I think this deck is really bad versus HollowVine. I think it's like not great versus shot. Like if you look at the sideboard of this deck, you can kind of see where the deck feels like it's got problems. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sideboard slots for Bazaar of Baghdad. 3 extra, 3 specifically for shops, but like obviously you would probably bring in Swords against shops, maybe depending on the shop deck. Yeah, and this is a little bit polarizing in that specific matchup. And so when there's a really big amount of Bazaar, which is what you're seeing now, I would consider, Jeskai to be on a downswing, in which it is. The problem, the conflicting power there is there's more Bazaar, so Jeskai is less good. But because there's more Bazaar, Bug is better, which makes Jeskai better. So you kind of have it's cyclical and it's a week-to-week thing, right? And if you like playing these decks where, I mean, if you consider yourself a Magic player who's played a lot, has played a lot of Brainstorm and Legacy, consider yourself not a reasonable Magic player. I don't really want to frame it that way. Someone who's experienced with like playing cantrip decks, playing lots of Magic, understanding where you're getting your advantages by playing cantrip decks. Specifically Legacy Brainstorm players. I think this is a great home, a great place for you to find a deck that really suits you. And I do think it's a little bit underrated right now. Yeah, I think you'd excel with this kind of deck, Edgar. Just by playing a few leagues and understanding how you play your matchups, you'll think you'll fit right. You'll fit right in for it. Yeah, I found this deck to be pretty straightforward, but also not play towards my style. Obviously, I actually don't really think I'm that great of a Magic player. I think I'm okay, but like when I play against people who I know are better than me, you can really see the difference, in my opinion. So I actually found like this can be a pretty hard deck for me to pilot personally. I found that the combo decks lend towards my playstyle a little bit better. Probably not as patient as I need to be with this kind of deck. But I've definitely seen plenty of people pick this deck up and do very well. So, like I said, you have 10 cards in your sideboard for Bazaar. That's your big problem. And even when you have 10 cards in your sideboard for Bazaar, it's still not good. Like it's still a problem because you're almost certainly losing game one. You have hands that can beat Bazaar decks, but you're almost certainly losing your game one versus Bazaar. Good mentor hands can really help against Bazaar. Depending on which Bazaar variant, like if it's a Hogaak deck, maybe if you have a multiple Swords to Plowshares draw, you have a fighting chance. But if you played against like, oh god, and if you play against a Dredge deck, a HollowVine deck, you're such a huge underdog. In game one, you almost never win. And so that's why you need to board 10 cards in your sideboard, is because you need to win game 2 and 3. And game 3 on the draw. So yeah. Beerus, I'm sure, has played many of this matchup. Yeah, I mean, this is the control deck. So this control deck needs to see what the metagame is, build its deck to beat the metagame, and some weeks it might be the best deck, some weeks it might not. But I do think that for this tournament, I do think Jeskai is a reasonable choice, and I think that playing Jeskai is going to put you in a good spot. Like, I do think that P9 will probably be on Jeskai, and I'm sure he will do well. So, I think that's all I wanted to say about Jeskai. You have to respect this deck. It's just powerful. It doesn't look super powerful straight up, but the introduction of Mystic Sanctuary has really changed Vintage, I think. The ability to loop multiple, and like before you would like play Ancestral Recall and like maybe a Delve spell and maybe another Ancestral off a Dreadhorde, but but now like you have Mystic Sanctuary, you can daze your Mystic Sanctuary back to your hand, you can gush your Mystic Sanctuary back to your hand, you cast another Ancestral Recall. It really gets out of control extremely fast. And I think it adds another layer of inevitability where my Jeskai deck can play like these Force of Wills and Force of Negations and 2 for 1 themselves, but still be able to come back ahead on cards because of how many Ancestral Recalls they cast. I didn't talk about it. Sanchez had an interesting Jeskai list with a Niv Mizzet and a Chandra. I'm not a fan, but when you cast a bunch of Ancestral Recalls, you can sometimes be a little liberal on your card choices. In my opinion. Yeah, that is not the list I would recommend. If you want to play Jeskai, this is where I would start. I would start on the Power 9 second place list. And I would move from there to suit the list to your needs. So this is the starting list I would take. I wouldn't take this list. I know nothing against Sanchez. Obviously, they won the tournament and they had a really good tournament. I just don't think those card choices are super strong. So yeah, that's where I would start on Jeskai. Dredge. Dredge is the probably the weakest of the Bazaar decks at this current time. It took a lot of hits recently. By no means is Dredge unplayable, and I'm sure Dredge will find itself near top 8 or in a top 8 at some point. The Dredge list that I like to look at, I like Jerry's list a lot. I'm a pretty big fan of these lists. There's some wiggle room, but these pitch dredge variants, as it were, where you're playing counter spells that require you to pitch cards, is I think are pretty reasonable. I do think Creeping Chill was a good choice with the way the metagame is adapted recently. This deck is simultaneously easy to play, but very hard to play. It doesn't play anything like normal Magic. You're mulliganing until you find a Bazaar of Baghdad, and you're playing completely out of your graveyard, really. I don't have any super good resources since Beerus stopped streaming it for anybody to learn how to play it. So I don't know what else I want to say about it. I do think if you want to play a Bazaar deck, I don't think this is the one I would recommend. I think I would rather you try to play Hogaak or maybe HollowVine. And I'm sure your sideboard guide from a year ago in the Vintage Discord is pretty reasonable. Actually, somebody was asking about it recently. Oh, almost spilled the beer. Okay. I'm sure it's like the ideas behind it are fine, but I mean, one of these lists is pretty reasonable. This player is, I think, one of the better Dredge pilots, so you could check out this list as well. 3 Serum Powders is a little weird. Dredge players like to do some things that I don't really understand. The Necromancers befuddle me sometimes. Yeah, we're not going to show off this list. I mean, we'll show it off. It's pretty fun. This is 62 card Dredge cards with like a bunch of Chancellors in the sideboard and creep. This Noxious Revival gets me every time. Every time every time I try to get rid of their surgically extract their cards, they Noxious Revival the shit out of me, and it's so good every single time. There's actually some really funny videos where if you've seen any videos recently of me playing against Dredge, it's probably against them. And they can be pretty funny. I think they might be onto something with this Noxious Revival. I don't hate it. It ups your green count for Force of Vigor. Not that they're playing for Force of Vigor in the main, but it's a little bit of a more experimental list. Whereas I think that the Furier and Jerry and Cafe, they have a little bit more of a stock concrete list. I don't really think I want to talk about it too much more. Like I said, I don't have super great insight, or I don't have any videos, I think, of me playing Dredge at a high level to help without. I mean, I think if you are, you're a Dredge player in every format and you want to play Dredge, I actually don't think it's a big deal. I think you can play Dredge and you still have a chance of winning the tournament, even if it's not like the best choice. It's obviously a powerful choice. So that's how I feel about it anyways. Rug. Let's go to Rug. That's 4-color. I kind of want... Are these all 4-color? Okay, they're like all 4-color. There's no Rug lists? Why are there no Rug lists? Maybe Rug is within Jeskai. What's Yashimura's list? Oh, this is 4-color Deathray Shaman. But as you can see, Rug and 4-color Deathray Shaman and Rug without Deathray Shamans, they all kind of blend together. What's Yuta's list look like? Oh, this is another 4-color one. This is another reasonable one. The main idea is these lists all pretty much center around Renin 6. Obviously, another powerful legacy card that is has been banned in Legacy. These lists focus pretty heavily on Planeswalkers as your value engine, as your permanent value engine, and then Renin 6, with things like Mystic Sanctuary, Wasteland, Strip Mine, as ways to strip mine your opponent or loop through Ancestrals. I think that any list like this is another reasonable choice. This is actually pretty similar. See, it's got preordains, but it also has Deathrite Shaman. So I actually think this plays a little bit differently than Bug. It kind of plays more to the Jeskai area of things, but a little bit more tap out control as opposed to, more of a traditional control list. If I had to pick a list, I think Yuta's lists are pretty good. I think that's a decent place to start. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for his deck building. So, I thought there would be more in like a teamer in here, maybe. So here's a version without black, without Deathrite Shaman. It's got a little bit more planeswalkers, but also a lot more spells. So that's a different way you can build it. I can bring up. There's a list on Twitter. Let's see. Winged. I liked Wing's list from last night. I thought Wing's list from last night was pretty good. So this list, I don't think the sideboard's very good, but this is. I mean, I'm just trying to showcase the idea of a Ren and 6 based control deck. You are still playing Pyroblast and Preordains, but you're playing Tarmogoyf and Wastelands. Tarmogoyf and Ren and 6 is your powerful 2-drops along with a set of 3 mana blue planeswalkers. So I think that these lists are like pretty reasonable. I don't really know how they fare in comparison to Bug. Like, I assume you have a better combo matchup because you get to play Pyroblast, but maybe you have a worse Shops and Dredge matchup because you're playing less Wastelands and you're playing, more colors of mana, I would assume. Not 100% on that one. Let's just keep going because past 9, I want to make sure we get most of these decks that I want to talk about in. This is HollowVine. We've been talking about HollowVine a lot today on stream. I would snap play whatever the latest Montolio list is for HollowVine. Of the players who consistently pilot this, Montolio pilots it at the highest level, probably has the most top finishes, and puts a lot of effort into metagaming their sideboards and main deck slots. What this deck does differently from a deck like HogaakVine is you're playing more of a tempo / like Delver style of deck where you're trying to put a Hollow One or Vengevines into play and then protect them with your free counter spells, 4 Force of Will, 4 Mindbreak Trap, 4 Force of Negation, Misdirection, Force of Vigor. You're playing a true tempo strategy where you are putting a threat into play and you're trying to counter all the things that your opponent does. The way you don't lose too much advantage from all of these pitch counter spells is you have 4 Squee. Every turn, Squee returns from the graveyard, so you pitch Squee to your Bazaar, and when you find the first Squee, your Bazaar turns into a Faithless Looting every turn. When you find the second Squee, your Bazaar is drawing new cards every turn instead of being card disadvantage or being just card selection. So I think this deck is incredibly interesting to play. Like I said before, this deck does have a harder time than something like Hogaak in a Wasteland Bug metagame. But I do think it's still powerful. I don't see any reason why someone who understands how the deck plays couldn't take it to a top 8 in Eternal Weekend. I wouldn't be surprised if Montolio did so himself. So this is a deck to look out for when you're playing against Bazaar. It's one of the stronger Bazaar decks, and I have a lot of respect for this deck because it does really, really well against combo. So if you consider the strengths of this deck versus the strengths of something like HogaakVine, HogaakVine is going to do better against the creature decks and the fair decks. And maybe better against like the Shops decks. Whereas this deck is going to do much better against combo decks. Like this matchup is a nightmare for PO. It's a nightmare for Doomsday, I would assume. You have a whole lot of agency against combo when you're playing 4 main deck Mindbreak Traps. So, yeah. Your sideboard's a little weird for this deck. You end up with like a huge graveyard hate, a bunch of cards that help you return your Bazaars after Wastelands, and then some more specific answers. Karakas is answering a Lavinia. This deck is really weak against Lavinia. If you don't have a Force of Will and a Lavinia resolves, You can't cast any of your spells. You can't cast your hollow ones. You can only really return Venge Vines by casting Root Wallows and Memnites and getting them countered. So Lavinia is a pretty hard time for this deck to deal with. So Karakas, that bounces, Lavinia, Leovold, Hogaak. Karakas is pretty good there. And there's also Mazavith, which is like pretty good against like things like the PO pivot plan of Sprite Dragon or Blightsteel Colossus. This helps against those kind of pivot matchups where they're bringing in creatures that are attacking you. Thanks, Raphael. Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, there's like definitely some upside to the format, to there being multiple Bazaar decks in the format. There is some downside into, I think Hollow One probably exhibits some not very interesting play patterns, but all right, so tenor list, what we've been saying for the stream is that I think that most decks in the format are powerful enough and good enough in the metagame where you could pick them and do fine. So it really is up to you where you want to pick a deck that suits you as a player. So like, what decks do you play in other formats? What kind of styles of play do you enjoy? And then what I would do is I would match up your style and your deck choice to a vintage deck, and I would learn that. So if you think, if you're like a Rug Delver player, maybe you want to play Jeskai or Hollow One. If you're a Hogaak player in Legacy, maybe you want to play HogaakVine. If you like playing the Jund style in Modern, maybe you want to play Sultai or Golos stacks, something like that. That's how I'm looking at it right now, Tenorless. I think every deck has some amount of learning curve to it in Vintage, and Vintage is a lot about knowing how to play different matchups. So you do lose some amount by being new, but obviously the cards are so powerful that you still have a chance. So I want to look at two more decks really quickly, and that's Oath, because you'll see it, and Humans, because I think it's a little interesting. Oath is a relic of bygone eras in Vintage. Oath has historically been a Vintage deck, but right now it's not seeing as much success as it used to. I would, if you play Hogaak in Legacy, I would definitely switch right to HogaakVine. If you check out my channel, there's a really good playlist on how I play through a challenge with HogaakVine, so definitely check that out. Oath it's just a little weak, a little slow, a little clunky compared to 2020 Vintage. It has some game where, for those of you who don't know and have never played an Oath of Druids, it's a 2-mana enchantment where if your opponent has more creatures than you, you flip over your deck until you hit a creature. So either your opponent plays a creature or you give them a creature with Forbidden Orchard, and then you flip into a Grizzlebrand or a Niv Mizzet or a Sphinx or a Grizzlebrand or a Grizzlebrand or an Emrakul. And the two ways you can play this deck right now are control and combo. Miharu Fuyumiya is a Oath expert. They play this control Oko Oath, and they made it pretty popular, at least in Japan, for the Japanese players. I don't think that many people play it anymore, but for a while, Miharu was putting up really, really strong results with it. You're playing a bunch of Okos along with a full set of Preordains and Pyroblasts, and tons of forces to enable a controlling plan where you're going to play Oath of Druids. It's been a little rough for them recently, but by all means, you will probably play against an Oath player at Eternal Weekend, because Vintage players just love to bring back Oath every time. So, it's a little tough to say, Ashwood. It's just slow. Doomsday wins on the same turn you cast Doomsday most of the time. Like Forbidden Orchard, the card itself is pretty clunky. If you don't have an Oath of Druids, obviously you never really want to tap your Forbidden Orchard. The card Oath of Druids itself, you play it and it doesn't do anything. Your opponent can get rid of the creatures, they can get rid of the Oath, they can stop you from searching, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. And this deck just lets a lot of things go wrong. And so it has a little bit of a challenge in that sense. There is another way you can play Oath. Sandy Dog is a great example. Sandy Dog is a PO Oath player, so this is more of a combo-centric Oath list. So it's basically a paradoxical outcome deck, which we saw, but instead of playing red for like Disruption and white for Mentor, what it does is it plays Forbidden Orchard and 4 Oath, as well as 2 Grizzlebrand, so that you have another avenue of attack, basically. Not only do you have Tinker Citadel and Time Vault Key and Paradoxical Outcome, but you also could just slam an Oath on the table and put a Grizzlebrand into play. Drawing 7 usually wins you the game. So there's 2 real ways to play it. You can play control or you can play combo. Personally, I don't recommend doing either. I think it's a little bit past Oath's time in Vintage, and I think of the decks that are on the fringe, looking on the outside looking in, this one is going to actually probably hurt your chances. So not one I would recommend, but something you should be cognizant of, I think. Another deck you should be cognizant of that I don't recommend, human variants. So there's a lot of ways to build this. There's no consensus on the right way to build it, but you can, and you probably will, see people play different kind of hate bears and human decks. They hinge a lot on Thalia. Thalia is probably the premier card in this deck, the one that's going to win you the most games, prevent your opponent from doing things. You get to attack opponents' mana bases with strip mines, and you get probably the best Deafening Silence deck. Well, that's not true. You're the second best Deafening Silence deck, because Hogaak is the best Deafening Silence deck. But you can play these hate bear creatures like Collector Oof and Thalia, combined with a reasonably fast attack shell with the human synergies, and it's playable. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't know how else to say this, but you kind of need to be on the play, and then you can't beat shops. So when you combine those two, you end up in a really rough spot. I just want to show you that this deck exists and it can be there, but I don't want to push anybody towards it. I really don't think this is the best way to use your Black Lotuses and your powerful Vintage cards. But it's something that you can certainly get punished by. A PO deck is never going to want to see an uncounterable Thalia on turn 1. If you're playing against an uncounterable Thalia on turn 1, it's going to be pretty rough for you. But I think that is all the major stuff. Take one more look at the quick. How many? Oh, all right. That's not a real deck. Storm is not. You don't want to play Dark Petition Storm. You want to either play Doomsday or PO. The reason that Dark Petition Storm isn't very good is because it doesn't play Force of Will, which is a problem. You need to play Force of Will right now. So you got all kinds of different humans and hate bears lists. You have some Eldrazi lists and some like, oh, we missed Ravager Shops. That's what we missed. One more. All right, so the other kind of shops deck you can play that is not Golos is an aggro-oriented shops list. And now there hasn't been very many posted shops lists recently, but when in doubt, find Andy's last list. So I think he's experimenting a little bit with some of these one-ofs, but the idea is the same, and the idea is what we're going to talk about. Yeah, I actually have a couple of human videos on my YouTube if you want to go check them out. Humans is certainly playable, but it's not something I would recommend you to play. Shops, aggro shops has historically been a great deck in Vintage. Recently has struggled because of the reasons I highlighted earlier in the show. I talked about how Force of Vigor was printed. That made things really, really challenging for a deck that's trying to attack with artifacts. PO exists. PO is a 4 Hurkyl's Recall deck that's very, very good against aggro artifacts. But I don't think you should count this deck out. The clocks that this deck presents are fast. The disruption that it presents with spheres and revokers is real. And the Arcbound Ravager Ballista combo is still effective, where you can stack your board onto a Ravager and then onto a Ballista and deal double the damage. Your sequencing matters a lot. Your combat math matters a lot. You want to get some reps in and see how to play against the field with this deck. But I I stress that I think that this deck, if you can figure out the best way to build it and play it, might be better than playing Golos Shops in this current metagame. I don't know the right ways to do such a thing. That's not my area of expertise, but I want you to know that this is the other Shops deck that exists. It plays a much more aggro-oriented style than Golos, where Golos is playing a prison style. It's a slow kill. This is a fast kill. You're using your Mistress Workshop to power out Foundry Inspector, to power out your whole hand by turn 2. Try to lock yourself opponent under some Spheres of Resistance and Wastelands, and attack your opponent with really big artifacts. So you should be aware this exists. This might be a deck you'd like to play. If you wanted to play a deck like Humans, that kind of deck suits you, I think I would recommend Ravager Shops instead. Draven says, oh, it's Draven, what up? I'm new to Vintage, but I like the agency that Golos had over Ravager Shops. Sure. That's people do like the toolbox that Golos provides. My biggest problem is obviously the speed. I think that Golos is not a speed that is like acceptable in Vintage, and that's just my opinion. And we talked about this a little bit when I talked about Golos. People have success with Golos, and people like how Golos feels. And I'm not going to take that away from them, but that's, in my opinion, I think Golos just does not do things at a speed that you really want in Vintage. I think we covered everything I wanted to cover. I don't know if there's anything else I want to talk about specifically. Man, that was a lot of talking though. That was fun though. Appreciate everybody hanging out. Do I have any lists that I want to share? Doesn't look like it. The nice part about the recent Golos lists is the four Stonecoil Serpents. I think the addition of Stonecoil Serpents has really helped that deck. I think the deck was really bad when it had no Stonecoil Serpents, but now that it plays Stonecoil Serpents, you can actually clock them a little bit faster. Yeah, but I think by being that slow, you actually are enabling too many ways to get out of the lock. Yama jokingly asked DPS. I'll just show DPS really quickly. This is a Dark Petition Storm deck. You don't play Force of Will, you play Defense Grid and Duress instead. And because you play because you don't play Force of Will and play Duress and Defense Grid instead, the deck is not very good. The biggest problem with this deck is it has a really bad PO matchup. Abysmal PO matchup. And like the deck is obviously at a power level where it's really, like, you know, it's a Vintage power level deck. The deck does extremely powerful things on turn 1 and turn 2. But you're just not a Force of Will deck. And right now, I think in Vintage, you kind of, if you're blue, you should really be a Force of Will deck. So, if you really want to cast Dark Ritual, I recommend casting Doomsday with it. So, that's basically DPS in a nutshell. By all means, like, this deck is at a power level to be playable in Vintage. It just doesn't line up very well. Oh no, Jarvis. I appreciate the raid. Welcome everyone from Jarvis. We're just finishing up a roundup. We're just finishing up a discussion about Vintage decks, the metagame, what I suggest, what I don't suggest for Eternal Weekend. We've been alive for, I don't know, a couple hours now talking about it. If you're interested in that at all, if you think you want to play Eternal Weekend, I'm gonna put this VOD on YouTube. So if you check out my YouTube after the stream, the whole VOD will be there. You can watch it at 2x speed, and you can learn about you can learn all about the Vintage decks and how they play and what they play against in the metagame, all that kind of things. Borg asked, I just tuned in. What do I suggest? The main thing to take away from this stream is I think that all of the decks all the tiered decks in Vintage right now are certainly playable. And so what I recommend that people do is they find a deck that matches their play style. And they get repetitions with that. So if you like playing Brainstorm decks in in Legacy, maybe you would like to play a Jeskai deck in Vintage. If you like to play Hogaak in Legacy, maybe you want to play Hogaak in Vintage. If you like to play a Delver style, maybe a HollowVine deck is more up your up your alley. If you're a Necromancer by trade, maybe HogaakVine or Dredge, combo Wizard, PO or Doomsday. If you're some kind of Jund player, if you like playing those fair decks, Sultai mid-range probably the best place to be, or maybe Golos stacks. I can't tell you what your play style is. That's more of a you thing. You tell me what your play style is, and I'll tell you a deck you should play. But what I want to stress right now is that Vintage is really balanced around the brokenness that it is Vintage. And I think that any of these decks really will set you up to a place where you can succeed in the tournament. Obviously, you should practice and start learning how the deck plays against the field. But I don't think that playing these decks that I presented are going to hinder your success. So that's basically the theme of the night, and that's what we talked about over the last 2 hours or so. I am looking to sign off now. I'm gonna find you guys someone who is streaming, some Vintage probably. There should be somebody, and then we can have you guys watch some matches. But for me, my next stream is going to be 3 a.m. Eastern on Saturday, the very first Eternal Weekend Vintage event. I will stream that event in its entirety or until I get knocked out. And then I will stream the 5 p.m. Saturday Eternal Weekend Vintage event. And then I will stream the 1 p.m. Sunday Eternal Weekend Vintage event. So there's going to be tons and tons of Vintage to watch this weekend. If you stop by my channel at any point, that's a good one. At any point, you will find some Vintage to watch. So